All right, good. Anyways, so apparently, because your brains are different, men, you have to move a little more because you're large motor minded, literally. Your brain is large motor minded. So you absorb things while you're doing. So if you just sit sedentary, you tune out quicker than women do. It's just the way God designed us. Uh, so if I stop and say, stand up, you might think, ooh, I must have been falling asleep. Of course, you wouldn't do that while I'm preaching, so I'm not expecting that. But I just thought that was an interesting piece of information. And our children's ministry is predominantly boys. As you all know, you've all seen them running around here. It's predominantly boys. So Miss Tracy is the perfect children's teacher, and Vonnie and Miguel, because they keep them busy. They're moving around, so they're learning. They're not getting bored. So when Pastor Steve said, you're about to have the most fun you've ever had, he meant it. So I know what they have planned back there. Anyways, so I thought that was kind of interesting how we are different, and Jesus wants us to get all we can get. Amen. So why not learn about ourselves and help ourselves? So if you have to stand up once in a while to keep yourself actively involved, I'm going to try this. Thank you for leaving it up here. See how it goes. I was fascinated. I've been fascinated with what the Lord told Thriving Life, and that is 2025 is the year to draw near. I'm fascinated with that because that's always been near and dear to my heart. I've done some women's conferences where I've taught on drawing near, and the Lord's been talking to me a lot about it and how we actually do that. And last week I presented the message about high priest, but Jesus being the high priest is why we can draw near to the heart of God. And I really wanted to make that clear that without Jesus as the high priest, we would still be drawing near the way Moses and the Israelites drew near, which means you wouldn't have a heart to heart connection. You see, we'd be drawing near on the surface the same way they did. We'd be bringing sheep and goats and cows and all kinds of things for slaughter so that their blood would temporarily get us access to hear from God. And we wouldn't hear from God directly. We would only hear from God through the man of God or the woman of God in the case of Deborah. Yeah. There were women that were used as well, not just men in the Old Testament. God would speak to someone that was anointed on the outside to hear from him, and then they would share to the people. In fact, when God called Moses, he told Moses, you will be like God to Pharaoh because Pharaoh can't hear me. You'll be like God to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your mouthpiece. So you'll tell Aaron what to say, and Aaron will say it. So right there, that's a whole chain of events. You see, we don't have that. If you're born from above, you have the ability to hear God for yourself. And that's good news. That is really good news. So that's what was kind of interesting to me about drawing near is that do we recognize what a privilege and an honor it is that we've got direct line of communication to God because we have a high priest. But the high priest that we're referring to is Jesus Christ, who not only was the high priest, but he was the sacrifice that the high priest had to bring in to the temple, and his blood is the blood that's on the mercy seat. And that's what gives us access to God. And I know because we've never functioned in that, other than maybe, like I referred to the priestly ministry that we know in different denominations, but we have never functioned this culture that we live in. They really don't. We don't have the reference to understand about sacrifice the way they did. And yet, if you just take time to see yourself at the cross, if you take time to use your imagination that God gave you and approach the cross while Jesus is hanging on it, And look at the scriptures and see what they say about that. There's scriptures that say he was unrecognizable as a man, and that's standing at the front. Standing at the front of the cross as he's hanging on the cross, saying, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. As he's hanging on that cross, he doesn't even look like a man. He's so marred. But that's the front. What about if you walk around to the back? As Sherry so aptly shared about that crown of thorns jammed into his head and the blood running down, what do you think his back looked like? Because that's where he took the stripes for us. So you walk around in the back of the cross and you're going to approach sickness trying to attack your body a whole lot different. But see, we have to use our God-given imagination to apply what the word says and tell us the truth. If we just read it with our ears, it becomes read it with our ears. Well, that's a challenge. What? What? If we just read it and let it fall on deaf ears, just read it like, oh, I've read that before, or we don't pause, take notice of what's being said and let it illuminate our hearts. Look at it with our spiritual eyes and our spiritual ears, because that's what makes the difference. And I'm convinced that's what happened to Moses. Uh, Moses, whew, I would love to be able to have the time to tell you everything that God has shown me about Moses, because it's just like, wow, he's a type and shadow of being a redeemer, because he got the people out, right? But how his life started and how he was preserved by his parents because they were killing all the Hebrew children, because Israel was living in a place called Goshen. They were living in that place because Abraham was promised Canaan. He had a covenant with God. And so then his son Isaac had a covenant with God, right? And then his son Jacob had a covenant with God. So God is called the God of who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why? Because he had a covenant with those three men, right? And then Joseph comes in. He's the son of Jacob. And he hears from God in a dream, a couple of dreams. And you know his story, and I don't have time for all of it, but he is taken into bondage, and it was on purpose to get him into Egypt to spare the Israelites. Provision was made ahead. Well, Joseph goes to Pharaoh and says, let my family, there were 70 of them, let them live in Goshen. Then they'll be near to me. Goshen means draw near. Let them live there because then they'll be near to me. Because it had already been prophesied to Abraham that their family would be in bondage for 400 years. 400 years. But the deliverer was coming. And that was Moses. So now fast forward to Moses' day, he is spared. He's not killed because everyone living in Goshen is multiplying. God's blessing them. They're multiplying, they're multiplying, they're multiplying. And the Pharaoh freaked out thinking they're going to overtake us. We got to do something about this. Right? You know the story. So they're trying to eradicate the Israelites by taking all kinds of horrible measures. But Moses is spared. So he, at about 40 years old, he has a discovery of who he is. And it says he goes back to check on his brothers. He goes in to check on his brothers. This is in the book of Exodus. He goes in to check on his Hebrew brothers and see how they're faring. And he sees an Egyptian assaulting one of his Hebrew brothers. So he takes matters into his own hands and he kills him. He got out ahead of God. The passion for his people overtook him and he kills the Egyptian. Now he's running for his life. And it says he runs to the backside of the desert next to the mountain of God. So that's where we find Moses, in the backside of the desert next to the mountain of God. And all of a sudden he sees a bush. So I'm swinging back around to stopping when you're encountering God and you see something in the Word and it's burning. You ought to do what Moses did. It says Moses stopped and drew near, and then the voice of the Lord spoke. But if we're going to the Word of God like just our daily duties, paging through the scriptures, or I've got to do my reading today, or I've got to do my prayer today, and we just consider it as one of our little duties of the day, then we just move on. But if in that time of pausing and communing with God, something burns, I would recommend you draw near. Because had not Moses drawn near at that burning bush, he would not have discovered who he was, and he would not have discovered what his purpose was, and he would not have been equipped to do it. See, drawing near to God enables us to hear the voice of God, and that's then where we get our instruction. We find out who we are, we find out what our purpose is, and we find out what equipment we have to fulfill the purpose. But so many people are walking around just think, well, I just don't know what to do with my life, or I just don't know what to do. I just don't know what to do. I just don't, because you're not drawing near with your hearts. See, that's the difference now. Moses needed that external. He needed the external because he wasn't born again in his spirit. So he needed the external. We don't need externals. We're born again in our spirit, so our hearts are alive to God. So when we take the time to draw near because we've made the decision to do it, we'll see a burning bush, but we're not going to see it out here. We're going to see it in here. It happens to a lot of us as we're reading the word. All of a sudden, man, that happened to me yesterday. I was reading something that wasn't even to do with devotions or anything like that. I was reading an article I wanted to read, and they referenced a scripture. And when they referenced the scripture, I couldn't get past the first 3 words. I knew that was a burning bush experience. It changed me. It changed me. It changed my perspective, and it changed what I'm doing. Like Pastor said, change. Unless you change, nothing changes. So that burning bush experience that I had yesterday, although momentary, it impacted me, and I had to make a change. See, that's what repentance is. Turn and go a different direction. You see something, you're like, ooh, I'm going to make that adjustment. I'm going to turn from the way I was doing it, and I'm going to do it different. So thank God that Moses did that. He paused. Let's read it in Acts chapter 7. This is the account of Moses. Here's a funny for you guys. So I've been spending days and days and days, weeks and weeks, reading Moses' account, Joseph's account, Jacob's account. I've been logging it. I love to write as I'm reading because it helps me remember, and it helps me pause. I'm not just glossing through as I read. So I'm writing what's impacting me as I go. And so I'm chronicling. Is that the right word? Chronicling. Well, I'm doing it. I'm doing it as I go. And so I'm going through all their lives and I'm taking notes about it, notes about it, notes about it. And I was like, man, wow, Lord, this is just amazing. And he goes, well, look at Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. Well, there it is. The whole thing. It's in Acts chapter 7. Stephen preached it. Stephen preached it and got stoned for doing it. But so we're not going to look at everything he preached, but we're coming down to we'll pick up on the Moses part. Verse 24. 7:24. Acts 7:24. This is Moses. They're talking about Moses. I think I want to read it in I'm going to read it in New Living. I said 24, but I meant 23. One day when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his relatives, the people of Israel. He saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite. So Moses came to the man's defense, avenged him, killing the Egyptian. Moses assumed his fellow Israelites would realize that God had sent him to rescue them, but they didn't. That ever happened to you? You've had something in your heart to share with someone, you just know God told you to do it, but they didn't receive it. Maybe it's because we delivered it wrong. I don't know. But here, Moses took it to another level, trying to avenge his brothers. But God had a better plan. So the next day he visited them again, and he saw two men of Israel fighting. He tried to be a peacemaker. Men, he said, you are brothers. Why are you fighting each other? But the man in the wrong pushed Moses aside. Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? He said. Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday? So when Moses heard that, he fled the country. He fled the country and he lived as a foreigner in the land of Midian. There his two sons were born. 40 years later, so it sounds to me like he went to the desert and he kind of settled in. Yeah, he lived as a foreigner. It says he lived as a foreigner, right? Had two children, married Zipporah, had two children. 40 years later, in the desert near Mount Sinai, an angel appeared to Moses in the flame of a burning bush. When Moses saw it, he was amazed at the sight. As he went to take a closer look, the voice of the Lord called out to him. The voice of the Lord called out to him. Here, New King James says it this way. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him. So see, as you're drawing near to observe something that's burning in your life, something that you see God is drawing attention to. It's not necessarily even when you're reading the word, but God can be drawing attention to something in your life. That's an opportunity to draw near and get a closer look because you're going to hear from God. He's going to speak to you if you draw near in that moment because he speaks to your heart. He speaks to your heart. But I asked him for another example of how we can see that in the word, and he showed me Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha drawing near. And that I found that in that's in Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, verse 38. It says, it came to pass as they went. So this is Jesus and his disciples. They entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha. So this is certain. This isn't an allegory. It's not a type and shadow. This actually happened. There's a real woman named Martha, a certain woman. And she received him into her house. So she invites him in. And then in verse 39, it says she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet. And she heard his word. So we're talking about Mary and Martha. And we're talking about drawing near. Now Martha was cumbered, King James says. Martha was cumbered about with much serving. And she came to him, Jesus. I thought that was kind of interesting because she invited him into her house. And he gets comfortable, obviously, because Mary's at his feet. But Martha comes to him. That's just an interesting kind of dynamic to me, if you think about it. Invite him into your home. He gets comfortable. Your sister sits at his feet, and they're obviously having a conversation because she's not just sitting at his feet. And that was the other thing. Like, Lord, what was he talking about? So Mary's drawing near, sitting at his feet, and Martha comes to him. And she said, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to serve alone? And, we could go off in a whole bunch of trails, but not today. Bid her, therefore, that she help me. So now, she not only invites her guest into her home, he's comfortable, Mary's sitting at her feet, but she goes to him with her issue and says, aren't you going to fix it? Whose house is it? What? Jesus said to her, Martha, Martha, you are careful and troubled about many things. But one thing is needful, and Mary has chosen that good part which shall not be taken away from her. Mary's chosen the part that should not be taken away from her. What part was that? The part of sitting at his feet and listening to what he had to say. even if he didn't say anything. Just being in his presence, just hanging there, just sitting there, waiting to maybe he will say something. Maybe he wasn't saying anything, but maybe he will. I doubt that he wasn't, but maybe he isn't, and she's waiting to see if he does. And she's sitting at his feet. That's another interesting thing. That was a sign of respect. She's not sitting up cozy and up next to him. You know, a lot of times people want to get all up in your business, get all cozy with you, and your friends. She wasn't doing that. We're not. We're not doing that. It's me. No, she's sitting here at his feet, and she's hanging on every word that he has to say. Yeah, hoping he's going to say something. But Martha, 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 you're cumbered about. That's an interesting word, cumbered about. That's why I have my notes, because I can't remember it. Martha, Martha, you are cumbered about. That word means to be dragged all around. To be dragged all around. So apparently she had this big long to-do list, but it was her perception of the big long to-do list that it took precedence over her guest. It took precedence over the time she could spend with him. So she's letting the list, the distractions drag her all around. That's what it says. He said, you are cumbered all about. How many times do we do that? Not with even serving or acting, but our minds. See, I love this parallel because I see Mary as the spirit and Martha as the soul. Mary as the spirit who heart to heart is in that connection. She's there. She's in it. She's listening at every moment. She's sitting at his feet. She's made the connection with God. She's drawing near and she's not leaving it. Whereas Martha, she's all up in the soul. What about this? And what about that? And what about this? And what about that? That's what the soul does. Then the soul takes on information. Well, what did they mean by that? Well, what did they mean by this? Well, I feel like this and I feel like that. And that makes me, and this makes me, and that makes me. That's dragged all about. And I think I've shared this testimony before, but it bears repeating. When we were students at Rhema, or maybe not even students yet, we went to a conference. And the place isn't significant other than the fact that we were on that campus and I witnessed this thing. But the Lord spoke to me. And how he spoke to me really shocked me. I'm in the restroom. And as I'm walking out of the stall, I see a woman come in with like a child a little bit older than Salem, maybe 3, maybe 4, steadily walking, but the mother had grabbed the child by the arm and said, I said, get in here right now. And I watched it. I mean, I'm surprised the kid's arm didn't get dislocated. But the minute I saw that, the Lord said, that's what you let the devil do when he has access to your soul. He jerks you all around. He jerks you all around. And that's why people are having trouble hearing what God said. I don't know what God said. I think this is what God said. Well, it's because you're letting your soul jerk you all around. We are spirit man, the one that's born again, the one that knows Jesus as Lord and Master. We are the ones that are to steward our bodies and our souls. Our souls are not to steward our bodies or our spirits. That's backwards. We, the real man. You've heard my husband's testimony. Who are you? He's having symptoms in his body. He's driving his truck. I feel so bad. I feel so bad. I feel so bad. And he hears the Lord say, who are you? And he had to say it to him 3 times before he realized, oh, yeah, I'm the real one on the inside looking out the body windows. I'm the real one on the inside. I'm not my emotions. But see, we get confused in that. If we're accustomed to walking by our emotions, if we're accustomed to letting things whip us around, then when God does speak, we're not sure, is that God or was that me? Is that God Or was that me? So we're always uh, questioning whether or not we hear from God. And I would say if we're accustomed to letting our emotions whip us around, then we're probably not hearing God. Not that He's not talking, but we're missing it because He talks in peace and a still small voice. Where Jesus said, cumbered, you're cumbered, cumbered. And we all know what that means. There's an agitation, there's a swarm, there's a this got to be done, or what about that, or I feel bad, or I'm so sad, or I'm so mad, or I'm so worried, or I'm. That's all soul stuff. Not that you're not going to feel it, not that you're not going to have emotion, but we say all the time, you don't deny your emotion, you just deny them action. You can acknowledge your emotion to the Lord, take it to the Lord and said, this is really tripping me up. We said that when I ministered on Joseph and he got the information that Mary is pregnant and it wasn't his. His emotion would really trip him up, right? So you have Mary and Martha and how cool of Jesus to acknowledge that there's a better part. There's a better way. She chose the higher way, the better way. Drawing near to God is the higher way. It's the better way. And Moses had to do that as well. When Moses saw the burning bush, he had run for his life. You realize that he ran for his life because now word was out he killed a brother, an Israeli, and the Egyptians know it. And he killed an Egyptian. So the Israelites know it and the Egyptians know it. So he runs for his life and he goes to the backside of the desert. I don't think he was planning on connecting to God, but he did. But the interesting thing is the things that God told him. See, Acts tells us that Moses was trained in all the wisdom of Egypt. He was trained in all the wisdom of Egypt. So everything God asked him to do, he had to lay aside because that's not how Egypt does it. He's trained in all the wisdom of Egypt. That's how they store their food, how they how they build their what do I call them? What are they called? Pyramids. How they build their idols, how they administer medicine, how they do surgery, because that's where it came from. Surgeries came from Egypt. They've made the discoveries. They found the mummies where they have operated on brains, and they say they're the first ones to do it. Moses was trained in all the ways of Egypt. So now, when God gives him the assignment, well, first of all, God says, you're going back. I've been gone for 40 years and I ran for my life, and now you're telling me to go. Well, that's the first thing that he's got to cross. And that not to mention all the things they have to do to get the people free. And it's interesting with every single plague that came, I'm talking about Moses now, every single plague that Moses had to announce was coming was dealing with something they worshiped. Every single plague dealt with something they worshiped. So he's bringing the news and then administering the justice, raising the staff, right? They're finally free and they go out into the wilderness, and now there's problems. Now, Moses could have relied on what he knew when there's problems. I mean, they're getting bit by snakes. He could have relied on what he knew. Well, when I was in Egypt, when any time somebody got bit by a snake, this is what we did. We killed that snake and we made him drink the venom. Suppose. But he didn't rely on that. He went to God and said, what do I do? What do I do? See, and he was becoming accustomed to hearing God's voice because he paused when he saw the bush. So now he's inquiring of the Lord, inquiring of the Lord, inquiring of the Lord, and he's becoming accustomed to hearing God's voice. Remember, there was no Old Testament for him to read to familiarize himself with God. He wrote it. So there is no Old Testament for him to read. It's only his time with the Lord. And now he begins to pen what the Lord is telling him. So everything we have, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Moses wrote it. So just think about that. He now is hearing in his heart. The Lord is instructing him. The people have been murmuring and complaining against God and against Moses and against Aaron, and snakes come and they're biting them. And you've heard Pastor share this testimony. It's a testimony because it happened. And they're dying. And God tells him what to do. So he's got to abandon what he knows and step out in faith and obey the voice of God. And what does he tell him to do? He says, put a serpent on the pole and have him gaze at the serpent. Draw near. Take time and look at it. Let it speak to you. That serpent represents Jesus and us because we were crucified with Christ. All of our sin crucified with Christ. That's why the snake was used. The snake was used to represent sin, hanging on the pole and being crucified. And the people had to look at that to be healed. Instead of going the way that they would have done it in Egypt. So Moses' drawing near equipped him to do it God's way. And I'm convinced that's why the Lord is giving Thriving Life the message to draw near for 2025, because we're going to need to be equipped to do it God's way. We are going to need to be equipped to do it God's way. So I asked the Lord, why is it that many times we resort to our own ideas? Why is it we resort to what we know? And he said to me, because you don't trust your ability to hear him. You don't trust your ability to hear him. That's because you're listening to too many voices. You're listening to too many voices. I guarantee you, if we went and got Salem right now, I love to use that little example because I'm exposed to her a bit and I'm getting to know her, not like her parents do, obviously, but I guarantee you, if we told Jenna Lynn to go hide behind, well, maybe up on the back balcony, we told her to go up there, and we got Salem, and we said, don't be seen. And then we all just started talking and carrying on and da 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 da. And she started whispering, Salem, you know what's going to happen? Salem's going to know where her mama is, and she's going to make a beeline to get to her. But not because she's up there, Salem, and not because she's even seen, but because they draw near to each other. Salem knows her breath. She knows her smell. Her scent, I shall say. That's a better word. Scent is a beautiful fragrance. You smell the worst. I'll tell you that joke later. But you understand what I'm saying? Is that comes from drawing near to him. Drawing near and allowing him to reveal himself to you, revealing his heart to you. So drawing near is going to be vital and help us in the days to come. Such beautiful, beautiful examples we have in the Word to show us. Choose the better part. Choose the better way, like Martha did. I guarantee, or like Mary did. I guarantee you, things still get done. Yeah. Martha still got done. They probably all still ate. And here's the thing: you think about if Moses, as I said, if Moses had not drawn near, he wouldn't have got the instruction to go in and set the Israelites free, and he wouldn't have gotten the equipment to do it either. Now, Mary and Martha, one chooses not to draw near, the other one does. Do you know who was the first person to see Jesus after he rose from the dead? Mary. Mary. Don't even know where Martha is. Well, let's stand on our feet.